To continue by bringing up DC again, if you compare the question about conflict I made earlier and how to implement them against characters of supernatural capability, a stark comparison can be made between Superman in the majority of his continuities and virtually anyone in DBZ. The fact I would wager is not a coincidence. Superman has no conflict. Nothing ever puts Superman at risk. It is not possible to write a plot that gives him problems, especially if you look at the entirety of his abilities across the franchise as his powers become more and more absurd. This is a prime example of writers writing themselves into a corner. They have literally given a character so much control of his or her setting that conflict cannot arise from it. A literary dead end, such that the only way to produce conflict for given heroes is for them to literally borrow conflict from other people. They have no problems of their own, so they have to solve other people's problems. This is the biggest flaw with the superhero archetype, which is not to say it is a mistake, it is simply what set the precedent. But now it's time to ask for more. Perhaps the biggest testament to construction of conflict for Superman, I would also wager, is seemingly the entire existence of kryptonite can be seen as an invention created for the distinct purpose of bringing conflict to a character which would otherwise be entirely vacant before it was introduced around the 60th issue. And what is more shameful is that when kryptonite is not around, writers will simply tone down his abilities to fit the scenario to create conflict from nothing. Moreover, there are also over a dozen different types of kryptonite that give Superman different uncharacteristic conflicts, when regular kryptonite isn't enough, which I would also continue to wage are created to insert conflict in a setting that doesn't have it. This is what happens when characters aren't controlled by their setting or each other. Plot devices are used recklessly to mass-produce plot. DBZ suffers from the same problem, the exact same problem, but plot devices are used to spawn characters that are just out of the reach of protagonists so that they can be overcome with yet more training. And while this is a repetitive process, it is far better than pure Deus Ex Machina you see in Superman. In fact, perhaps the biggest proof that kryptonite is little more than a terrible plot device that is used whenever writers can't deal with its dead end of a character is the one and only Superman in a lead suit. And no, a well-built suit wouldn't just break. Superman himself fights robots and people with suits all the time that can withstand his attacks, and it should be trivial to make a suit that can protect him from harmful radiation without blocking necessary radiation with the technology or magic available in the DC universe from which the conflict arises from anyway. The point being that these are the only real problems Superman ever encounters, those that occur in expanded settings when he is forced to deal with people of his own caliber. But the truth is, I don't really blame them for any of this, or most of DC or Marvel, because like mangaka, artists of American comics, despite how I use the terms interchangeably, need to be defined as artists first, and writers second, when they perform both tasks. They don't necessarily know what they're doing. And again, most of this content, especially earlier content, was not meant to be viewed by an audience outside of young adolescents. The evolution of this appeal is a fairly new phenomenon. Viewers take the medium more seriously now. This is a very good thing. Very few people understand this essential point, which I cannot emphasize enough, which is that half of the battle of making better content is making a better audience. Viewers themselves have to grow. The venue has to develop an acquired taste for good content before more of it can be demanded. This is done through criticism. You need to know what you want so developers can make it. You need to be able to articulate what is bad and why it is bad to see it disappear. Until then, devs like myself can only make what they would want and will assume correctly that the majority of the people don't know what they want. Casuals, for instance, don't know what they want because they have no acquired taste. Otherwise, it would affect the content they indulge. This actually isn't a stab at them so much as my other complaints, though. It's just a universal fact about anyone who is new to a venue. But in any case, casuals will instead continue to ask for more of the same because most of the time it's all they've tried. This problem, however, is not something I personally dedicated a lot of time to because I think the best immediate solution to this is the one everyone is familiar with. It's as simple as a good third-party game reviewer that will not sell out under pressure. But so far I have yet to see it, and I think everyone thinks pretty much the same. It just seems impossible. But now to show you what I mean by acquired taste and how it can give you an insight that changes your opinion by taking a look at another little-known fact about DBZ that only the most dedicated DBZ fans seem to understand. particularly the difference in strength between Goku and Vegeta, the main protagonist. It is something that is counterintuitive and may not even been realized by Toriyama himself, given that the show leads you to believe the exact opposite, which is that Vegeta is a more talented individual than Goku is. Let's take a look. The ubiquitous theme of aging is often used to identify greater power that comes with the investment of time. The age of Goku and Vegeta is ambiguous, and yet the difference in age can't really be all that great given that Vegeta wasn't that old when the planet was destroyed, and Goku was sent to Earth, and therefore benefited only minimally from its gravity. Next we have Raditz, Goku's older brother, who can be used as an excellent measuring tool for how powerful Goku would normally be around the age of Vegeta. Next we have power level comparison, which many people write off as unreliable. This is a misinterpretation of how scouters are used. The authenticity of a scouter is in fact necessarily reliable, otherwise they would have not been employed in the first place by any of the races that use them or Frieza's empire. It is remarkably easy to see the correlation between the effects observed under calculations made by the scouters throughout the series and the responsiveness of the environment that demonstrates those predictions to be true, especially during the fight with Raditz. If the case is to be made that the information the scouter provides is unreliable and that there is no correlation, then the only conclusion is that Raditz's demise was either purely a mental block that he himself imposed and was really stronger than the attacks that killed him, or that the attacks were in fact way stronger such that the scouter didn't even come close to properly identifying the level of danger. The only exception to the scouter's legitimacy is against fighters from Earth, who have the uncanny ability to hide power, but simply choose not to while fighting Raditz. Which conclusion is more believable? The answer is clear, that the scouter correctly identifies a correlation, and hence Raditz can logically be seen around the same level of strength Goku would be at the age, which is coincidentally around the same time when he fights Vegeta, who would be nearly 20 times stronger than Raditz. This is where people start to lose sight of the scope of things. Firstly, Goku still doesn't compare with Vegeta on his own, but the real reason he prevails, which is consistent across the series, is because he has better training. Assisted training, to be precise. Goku died and received personal training from a demigod only available to a chosen few in the afterlife, where he learned special techniques not available to those in the mortal realm. And even then, he still doesn't compare to Vegeta and has to supplement his strength tremendously with these secret techniques. Goku and Vegeta are close to the same age with probably the same level of experience since they both have engaged in combat their whole lives, and yet Vegeta is 20 times stronger than Goku would have been without any assistance and is still stronger than him with it. Goku is completely outclassed and would have continued to be if not for another plot device in the next season, the gravity training. Vegeta, despite living among the races long capable of intergalactic travel, has apparently never thought to train in such an environment despite knowing beforehand that gravity training has helped the strength of his race for centuries, long before Goku ever had the chance or even knew about it. In fact, that goes for almost everyone in the galaxy apparently, since no one thought to utilize it, implying that Earth is also the home to the first person to use it, or simply the first to invent it. Which is another leap of faith to say that Earth has more gifted scientists and fighters despite being barely capable of interstellar travel. They even have scientists capable of creating robots stronger than Frieza, the strongest in the galaxy apparently. Go figure. Is anyone else's bullshit alarm going off yet? No? Well, how about when the planet they invented on just happened to be home to the only guy strong enough to beat them out of the whole galaxy? Not yet? Well, then how about when a guy from the future comes to deliver medicine so that they can fight an even stronger group of robots? But enough about plot convenience. Back to the training that Goku miraculously utilizes, which apparently no one in the galaxy has had the privilege to use and emerges stronger than Vegeta, but for real this time. They both get their Zenkai boost, yada yada, the end. Goku dies again, but not really. He instead goes to an alien world where he learns another secret technique. Vegeta plays catch-up and manages to unlock Super Saiyan naturally with pure willpower, putting them on par with each other until they both go into the hyperbolic time chamber, where apparently, despite having no history of being on equal footing with Vegeta's natural abilities without plot-assisted super training, Goku pulls ahead, even though Vegeta undergoes the exact same training, for seemingly no reason. Goku then dies again, but for reals this time, and resumes special training in Afterworld, where he is taught another secret technique and develops SS3. If you pay attention, it is clear that these things are not things Goku could have done on his own. Remember, he was weaker than Raditz when they met, and was completely in charge of his own training. and would have likely been around the strength of Raditz when Goku reached Raditz's age, which is much closer to Vegeta's age, yet leagues apart in power. His training in Afterlife plays an enormous role in explaining the success of Goku's training. Vegeta, on the other hand, is a Saiyan prince and should be stronger, as he points out himself countless times in this series, and is correct in thinking as such, and therefore equally baffled when he isn't. Little does he know that he is in fact more naturally talented, but loses out because of Goku's superior training and teachers, whereas Vegeta is entirely self-taught as far as we know, but erroneously admits inferiority to himself and to the audience. He is also more than likely the developer of the Gallic Gun and Final Flash techniques, as his father and any plausible teachers are all killed when he was likely much too young to have been taught them, of whom he had already surpassed apparently. Whereas Goku developed literally none of his own techniques, none of them, except SS3, which you may or may not even count since it really has more to do with bloodline than anything else, but is nonetheless the only thing he knows that isn't taught by anyone else. The Kamehameha, Kaioken, Instant Transmission, Spirit Bomb, Destructo Disc, Solar Flare, After Image, and Fusion are all developed by somebody else, which he has had the privilege and pure luck to have learned. On paper, it is absolutely clear who should be stronger, but isn't because the plot says so, because Toriyama says so, which, by the way, he would evidently admit as a mistake since they are both equals in the newest series, apparently, all of which is counter to what most people take away from the series. What you need to take away from this is that writers are not immune to mistakes. They are not above contradiction, and when they make these contradictions, they have made bad content, usually because they have violated one of the principles I've already mentioned. For instance, when Toriyama states that Goku can move faster than the speed of light, when light can move around the entire planet 3 times in a second, and we are supposed to believe that Goku has attained this speed because he wore a turtle shell on his back for a while. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He has violated the necessity of setting to trivialize this feat. Just because the author says so doesn't mean he's right, even if it's fiction, because hardly ever is anything completely fiction. Some part of the content always borrows from reality so that it is relatable, and as long as they feel like they can borrow concepts like physics of reality, a planet called Earth, or Japanese culture, they are required to adhere to all of its properties, and not just those they need. If they violate one of its governing rules, like relativity, you must explain it. When you don't, it's clearly absurd, which is okay. It's okay for a kid show that has tons of blood and violence and constantly talks about the end of the world, but the audience isn't dominated by kids anymore. And when hardcores demand an attempt at something serious, they are often left empty-handed, usually after already paying for it. This, again, is why the medium is not commendable, because there is no equivalent on the opposite end of the spectrum. The medium seldom evolves past this DBZ level of quality. Those are the kind of analytics that sustain immersion when held to standard, and they are the kind of critiques you will have to be willing to satisfy if you are trying to make something worthy of being called a masterpiece, due to its ability to withstand criticism while maintaining immersion. This, as I've stated, can be satisfied only by invested time into pre-production. This is the reason pre-production is difficult, because the more detail you allow, the more explanation you require. It is a job that continuously grows exponentially more difficult to complete, and yes, even the most well-known series and stories are guilty of not filling in all the gaps. Breaks in consistency with the audience like this is not preferential. The way people enjoy nuanced performance is by understanding how it works and why it works. This is the 7th principle of design. Quality must remain consistent. You can only appreciate detail if you can see it and measure the difference between detail and lack of detail. Quantity is quality. Nothing can compare to experiencing something yourself when you yourself predicted it because you understood the powers at work. This is why you will sometimes hear people acknowledge content that has the balls to kill its main characters or come to an ending, because the author correctly recognizes the hierarchy of writing and knows that setting dictates plot and characters, and that obeying their own established rules and details directly translates to keeping the audience informed with reliable narration. Remember, when you understand the setting More personally, you understand the severity of the conflict more. In gaming, this directly translates to the unique ability of gaming, which is to lend genuine feeling to a situation to the audience in first-hand perspective, instead of just handoffs between role-played characters. This is immersion at work, and your efforts to maintain it pay off in trainloads. This is why originality is all the more important, and why recycled content is not a substitute for more content, because cliches stale this feeling, and it quickly becomes meaningless. The discernible difference between the amount of detail in one piece of work and another very literally becomes its defining property. This goes twice as much for good works with lots of detail and a great work with more detail. I'll say that again. The difference between good and great are the details. The way you decide if something is worthy of a gold, silver, or bronze medal is the refinement. DBZ, to its credit, does this well, even though it breaks consistency. But as a part of a category purely for adolescents, even though it has clearly room for improvement, it is akin to a silver medal because it stands out when compared to something like Superman, which is authored for the same venue but explains little to nothing, and where nuance and consistency is very much not a factor, and therefore is a bronze at best. But what we really want, ladies and gentlemen, is the gold. We want it in the highest recognized category for literature for adults. This is delivered by detailed progression of what justifies what happens in the plot, like training of some form as shown in DBZ or Star Wars. When you see the main characters in these series, you understand why the characters hold the significance they do. You are watching as the characters pursued mastery over their setting, which allows for their abilities. In contrast, when you do absolutely nothing to explain why the plot is happening the way it is, and you don't care if your audience knows why anything is important, you have One Punch Man, which is the epitome of everything wrong with writing in the medium. The show does absolutely nothing to explain why it is the way it is. This, finally, is where inverse of quantity is quality becomes relevant. When deciding if a storyline is good material and you can't provide any substance one way or the other, it is inherently bad. Lack of any form of content, good or bad, is always objectively bad. This series demonstrates that writing has literally devolved to the point where the only difference between the conflict of One Punch Man and two kids saying to each other, mine is better because it can do this and this and other than that, and the other says, nope, mine's still better because I said so no matter what, times infinity, is that One Punch Man has a budget and a studio backing it. That's it. It's like they take pride in explaining as little as possible to the audience. It is literally nothing more than a farce under the most terrible alibi of having unreliable narration, and I don't care if they know and are being satirical, because it's not just One Punch Man. This is an epidemic in the genre. It is a systemic flaw that almost everyone makes, when your lack of explanation is what serves as suspense. When you get to say your character is blank or blanker than another indefinitely until you bother to say why, only proves that the only real strength or weakness that any character ever has is substance and depth, quality, in other words. Let me settle once and for all who the most powerful character is in fiction under this logic without dispute until the end of time. It is that 5-year-old you met when you were at daycare, because he doesn't have to tell you how strong he is or why. He is better than all of your favorite characters and gods put together no matter what. Don't believe me? Just ask him. You should never be able to say, I wish such and such was explained more, or how the hell did he or she do that? And especially not, I could do a better job. When watching anything that passes for professional, their success will only inspire more content with no soul or depth, and absolutely no mastery of precedence. In short, people get enjoyment from understanding the plot because the setting is compelling and it makes sense due to suspension of disbelief being addressed properly. So in summation, the new height of fascination of the medium, along with recent breakthroughs in technology that stipulate its advent, great content from great writers with great understanding of these principles I've laid out here and will continue to lay out in the future, will fill the gap in writing and make a series with characters like Superman, who represent the most powerful precedents that have been set, but with a setting that can still propagate conflict with just as much punch. A gold medal that puts the current precedents to serious work. The transition into gameplay of a setting like that would be fair to say unprecedented. That is what I'm here for. That's my goal. The point of this video is to get across the fact that the difference between good and great are the details, the explanations that matter, the consistency of immersion, the pull of the setting, the balance of themes. And while details by themselves are not exclusively what makes games good, it is what will separate good games from great games. The stories from the epics. Content itself is little more than cumulative details. So what you have to ask yourself is, what do you want? Exceptional or extraordinary? Exemplary or extravagant? Good or great? I'll also take this opportunity to state the 7 principles of my design philosophy very quickly in no particular order. 1. Quantity is quality. 2. Quantity must be balanced with theming. 3. Quality must remain consistent. 4. Setting is tantamount to immersion. 5. Believability is equal to its least believable component. 6. Exclude only the details trivialized by setting. 7. Suspense must be genuine. If you write your stories while following these principles, I can guarantee you, your story will be immersive and you won't have any plot holes. If you demonstrate mastery over precedence, you have a very high chance of being original. And now I'm going to do something I originally was not going to do, but because in the industry I think you need to be very afraid at all times. But at the advice of my talented friend, I eventually conceded. I'll discuss my content a little bit, which for the record you should never do. You should keep your ideas, especially your original ideas, a close secret and only discuss them with those you absolutely trust, like your co-authors, unlike my dumbass is about to do. So here goes. It is impossible for the natural to have any influence with the supernatural or act in any supernatural ways without supernatural methodologies. Furthermore, it is also not possible to perform any supernatural acts without a medium by which it operates, unless the action is an extension by the supernatural entity. This is because none of our faculties as natural objects have the ordinary ability to do these things, and it is required that something act as a bridge between the completely natural to the completely supernatural. It is worth mentioning, however, that this problem does not reciprocate for the supernatural. This has to come in the form of an interaction between the supernatural and the natural, in which the supernatural consciously makes the decision to interact or be interactable with the natural. As something supernatural, an entity cannot be disallowed or limited from breaking this rule via instilling or extending supernatural abilities to the natural, or a medium that should act as a vessel for those powers. By this specific methodology, the vessel could be considered to have become a hybrid of the two. This, however, is counterintuitive because of the law of excluded middle, which would denote something as either natural or supernatural. Yet to have the former perform deeds independently and capable only of the latter, its omission is required. This can be certain because of the 3, natural, hybrid, and supernatural, we, as priori, know that only we are, without a doubt, as described above, completely and totally are of the natural realm, and that the actions or relationships we ideate as beyond our abilities and that are inexplicable to science are therefore supernatural, leaving the middle as the only candidate to salvage this job, while still observing the law of excluded middle. The totality of which is to say, any action that we, the audience, perceive as supernatural that we, the characters, are innately somehow able to do, is, by definition, no longer supernatural in that context. It is therefore essential that we acquire a supernatural means by which to do these actions, if they are to be done at all, while remaining supernatural. The significance of this being that if characters are able to do these things naturally, they are, strictly speaking, no longer human, and that all of these actions is downplayed proportionally with the lack of embellishment appropriate for perceived supernatural actions. And moreover, by having inhuman potentialities void any kind of reasonable flair, characters are abiding by a standard that loses too much of its metaphorical weight via sacrificing realism when asserting these inhuman humanoids think and feel like humans, despite having supernatural abilities. This is synonymous with saying that extraordinary phenomenon would seem to have little to no perceivable effect on the outlook that should still be exhibited relatively by those inhuman humanoids. And although it is not necessarily true that the subject of the story are not able to express revelation towards their mentality with authenticity, compulsory alienation is what the audience experiences unavoidably as a result of their specific outlook being directly ignored, ostracized, or denounced due to the narrative's agenda being expressed exclusively through metaphor. This is an excerpt from an extensive thesis that goes on to describe around 30% of the basis of what will be my setting's supernatural features that I plan to use as a reference guide to teach everyone who will eventually be working with me on my game about its foundation. As a writer or lead designer, it will be your job to decide, as stated beforehand, just how far you are willing to go to provide depth to your setting, even down to the very ontology of your setting's universe. This will often require you to diversify your specialities many times over to be able to aptly provide a compelling setting-based plot, whether it be across philosophy, science, religion, architecture, or any of all of them combined. Now, the excerpt itself is merely a verbose way of stating that because the law of excluded middle, characters that perform supernatural feats are by definition now supernatural, no matter how many similarities they share with natural characters. And by crossing this line, you are inherently sacrificing a great deal of relatability with the audience who are normal people, and that in order to maintain this connection with any kind of authenticity, the supernatural have to break the logic by virtue of their supernatural position and act to facilitate the use of supernatural abilities by natural participants. The failure to make this distinction means the supernatural characters would, as a result, act illogically like natural people, effectively downplaying the significance of the supernatural itself, which is a break in immersion. An example of this would be something like people having the ordinary ability to fly, the reason for which is immeasurable by science. This would necessitate that a supernatural being has, with their unquantified power, ordained it as such, and that for people to subsequently live their lives as if this fact was of no consequence and simply gloss over it, severely fails to show with any authenticity how these people would react. But the whole purpose of this point is to serve as supposition for the following argument. Because all supernatural phenomena need to have supernatural origins which defy natural law, there can be no law in place that governs any of its effects. It has been my task to then transition science fantasy into science fiction by implementing new laws of nature that work concurrently to meet the following standard, which becomes the basis of technique with regard to use of all supernatural abilities. There must be a correlation between the components used in a supernatural act and its results. This is the basis of what I define as a unified magic theory, in which supernatural acts become measurable, for which I have an entirely separate thesis, and it is something that I alone am author of to the degree of depth, because as you'll agree upon examination, that magic that does not follow a coherent pattern of any kind does not have the ability to be taught as a discipline, and thus no technique, because its effects would therefore be random. This is a fact that almost every magic system that has ever been implemented has failed to recognize. You cannot teach magic that has random effects. You cannot master random. You cannot research random. You cannot invent random. You cannot indoctrinate random. Magic as a discipline is impossible if its effects are random. This includes things like magic words or the like, which would have no discernible reason for influencing nature. The natural world does not yield to the sound of our vocal cords until you say why it does. If your only reason is because magic, then your effects are random, because there would be no discernible difference between what is magic and what isn't. Lack of quantity is lack of quality. This means that schools of magic, magic techniques, and magic designs that go without explaining how their unified magic theory, or UMT in its respective setting, works, are trash and fail to provide depth to the setting. That concludes this video. It is much later than I anticipated it would be. I found myself having a lot of trouble deciding what to include in this video and what to save for other topics, so I apologize if it's in a confusing sequence. Everything in game design is interconnected and blurs together when you have been at it for years. I tried to be as verbose as possible and tried not to rely too much on presupposition, but of course doing so made it longer until I had an hour-and-a-half long video. Also, shortly in the midst of this, I realized my poor editing skills would make it take infinitely longer, so I chose to go without, since my videos are much longer than anything else you'll find on the subject, I'm sure. The next video will be on escapism. The one following will be on the differences in schools of thought in game design that I touched on briefly here, both of which will probably also be in many parts without editing for now. I'll eventually go back and make everything visually impressive at some point, but now I'm more concerned with getting my ideas out there for a while. And as I say that, I'm assuming that, like almost everything I've just talked about, these are my personal definitions All of my ideas are things I've learned on my own, analyzing other content and designing my own. But I'm sure I'm not the first person to think of them. One of my biggest fears that I've had before doing this is that I might accidentally plagiarize someone else without knowing it. And so I would like to ask if anyone knows where these topics are discussed in detail. I would be happy to cite them as an original source. Though keep in mind, I'm not talking about something like the kind of sources like guides or handbooks that discuss design docs and managing a team as a producer or something like that. I'm referring to something that discusses the ambition of the medium from an epistemological standpoint. I'm simply not aware if there is such thing as a scholar of game design, and I'm certainly not aware of their works if they exist. But, after all, the net, as they say, is vast and infinite.